This morning to introduce to you Simon Kendall, who is a regional director, I think, at Faithful and Gould, and he's going to talk to us about all things professional appointment. So I'll just leave it at that and hand over to you, Simon, when you're ready, please.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Yeah, Faithful and Gould is now Atkins Realis, just as a point, just to let everyone know. It's only a name change, all the people are the same, and the legal entities are still the same, which is the important element, as it were. So all existing appointments and contracts are still with the same legal entities, even though we've had a name change. So anyway, trying to do a little bit of a segue into my presentation, but right, I will now just select the tab to share, and it's going slightly slowly for some reason. Can everybody see?
I think it's just about there. We go. Yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so apologies for this. As I say, I'm used to working in the actual Teams environment. Working on the web app feels slightly different.
Yeah.
Okay, so professional appointments, an overview, and it is only an overview. There are lots of things to consider when looking at. Apologies. I was expecting the next slide to come up when I click on next slide, and nothing's happening on my end. There we go. There we go. So, what constitutes an appointment? Is an appointment necessary for a liability or a duty of care to be present? Now, that's a general question for everyone. Slightly rhetorical question, as I'm going to answer it myself. No, you don't need to actually have a formal appointment in place for you to have a liability or a duty of care to any third party. Reason this is relevant is it just highlights for me the importance of having an appointment. If somebody asks you your professional opinion and you give it to them without any qualification, clarification, or caveat, they're entitled to rely on it as advice. And that's why you should always be extremely careful in all dialogue when somebody's approaching you in your professional capacity. You need to put it into context. You need the advice that you give, if you give any. You also need to be ensure that you are not exposing them to risk by thinking that your advice is professional advice given all the facts, because 9 times out of 10 you haven't got all the facts. So that doesn't mean to say that you should then not give any advice. It's the nature of the business that we're in and what we do. You just need to be very careful how you give advice and in what manner, and how you then follow it up to ensure that you've got all the relevant information to ensure that the advice you've given is correct. Now, appointments can form, quite simple letters. There's short forms, standard forms, bespoke forms. Virtually 40% of all professional appointments that have been put in place last year, apparently, were bespoke forms of contract. Now, whether that includes heavily adapted standard forms, I haven't got the data on that, but it's an interesting stat to understand that circa 40% of all professional appointments were not using standard forms. They were bespoke forms, client-driven or sub-consultant-driven, or consultant-driven, I should say, where we've been appointed under T's and C's. Now, this just highlights that the standard forms that are out there and available for use don't offer all of the answers, so we do need to exercise a significant amount of care when using them. The key elements are obviously within the appointment. There's lots of protection that's provided, but it's irrelevant to have an appointment if you haven't got a clear scope that sets out exactly the tasks that you're trying to deliver, and also understanding what the duration of that appointment should be, the lifespan of it. because you don't want to be working on something that's completely open-ended. Now, other contract considerations. Contracts are your first line of defence. You know, we all operate in an environment where we're insured, but you should not be relying on your insurance. You should be relying on the contract and using the contract. Therefore, it's imperative that you understand exactly what the scope is within your appointment and what the liabilities, responsibilities, and consequences are of not delivering in accordance with the terms of it. You know, understanding the scope of your appointment is absolutely imperative. You need to make sure there's an avoidance of using vague statements. Maintaining specific language and defining deliverables in clearly measurable terms is absolutely imperative. You know, nobody likes being told, well, you told me you'd do this. It says in your appointment you'll do it. And you say, yeah, but that was intended to be a one-off at that point. Well, it doesn't say that though, does it? So it is really a fundamental basic of any appointment to make sure that the scope is clearly defined in terms of the time and extent of the exercises and activities to be undertaken. It's also important to understand the risks assumed under the contract, and the limitations that you do take on should not be assumed. You do need to be specific on the limitations that you want within your appointment. You've got to make sure that that happens clearly. The other thing, obviously, as a legal document, whilst you will have a working knowledge and you'll develop through the life of your career a greater understanding of what the contracts and appointments need to be, you really must ensure that they're reviewed by people who've got the appropriate experience and understanding of the risks and liabilities, to being sure that these fit within your insurance provisions, because, as I say, the contract is your first line of defence. You want to make sure that there are no gaps between the insurance provision that you have as either a sole trader or as part of a business, and the scope that's covered by the appointment. Because anything that's not covered in the scope, was not covered in the terms of the appointment, but is covered by your scope, but isn't covered by your insurance, means that there's a gap, and that gap means that you are ultimately held fully accountable for it, and you're not insured for any problems that arise out of it. The key element to understand is obviously that the majority of all contracts are negotiable. So just never assume that just because you've been presented with a fait accompli, as it may feel like or seem, with a contract or an appointment being put in front of you, that doesn't mean to say if there are terms in there that don't work for you, that aren't covered by your insurances, you shouldn't be going back and challenging them. But again, it means that this is why it's so imperative to understand that the person who's doing that review for you, whether it's yourself or a colleague, and you need to understand it, has that clear understanding of what's covered by your insurance, what you're insured to do, what you're experienced to do, and what you have the right qualifications to do. Avoid project-specific insurance. I've gone on a lot more about insurances, I suppose, than I have about appointments, but this is because the appointment is as I say, our first line of defence. Project-specific insurances can be taken out where there's specific appointments that have different nuanced elements, but the problem with taking out a project-specific insurance to cover off any additional nuances that aren't covered by your standard insurances are that you'll generally end up with duplications. Whilst they are specific, the cover is not as comprehensive, and therefore you end up, double bubbling some of the premium you're paying, and also you're potentially, sort of duplicating that cover. So it just creates a problem. So hence me emphasising the importance of ensuring that your insurance provisions are understood and fully catered for within the appointment that you sign. Other key contract red flags. What conversation about appointments wouldn't be complete without some discussion around fitness for purpose? It's a fitness for purpose is a guarantee that the final product, which may not be delivered by you, but which you are supporting the delivery of, should be capable of being used for the intended purpose for which they were purchased. Now, the problem with that statement is always it's the intended purpose. you may not have the full understanding. So you've got to be clear that you're operating not with any fitness for purpose elements within whether that's implied or explicit, within the appointment you sign, but with the appropriate reasonable skill and care obligations for you to act as a properly skilled expert in your field, which is effectively acknowledgement the scope can only be delivered in accordance with a known body of knowledge, as opposed to being a tool to definitively achieve a specific end. The key aspect of that is that obviously a fitness for purpose is reliant on third parties that you have next to no control over. So you've really got to ensure that you're avoiding any absolute obligations within any appointment that is not completely within your control. So words like ensure are real problems and need to be looked at, and sort of understanding the context around them. If it's ensuring that you have the staff available, then that's fine. But if you're ensuring that satisfactory tenders are returned, well, you're up against a sticky wicket there, because obviously that's not something that you can ensure and act professionally, because you've got an obligation to go to the marketplace and the market will come back with what they think's right. Obviously, insurance, any work is undertaken under a reasonable skill and care obligation is insured, under your professional liability insurance. However, if you are, if there are specific exclusions, either fitness for purpose clauses, then you're not actually covered by your insurance. So hence the importance of trying to ensure that those are not included and are specifically highlighted and pulled out. There's a whole host of potential contract red flags that you should look out for. You've got to appreciate that all contracts are not similar. The outputs that you're trying to deliver, the project that you're involved in, the service that you're providing, they all have an impact and a bearing on the nature of the contract and the implications of the contract terms. And the contract language can vary greatly. So you've got to be very careful that you understand what it is you're signing up to ensure that you are providing the right service and providing the right level of protection to yourselves. Excuse me a second, sorry. There's a quite significant potential for significant costs to be incurred as a result of misinterpreting or misunderstanding contractual requirements. So again, read your contract, make sure you understand it, make sure if there's something that you're not clear on, you have a discussion over. Make sure that you can actually understand that what the client's expectations are within specific contract terms and within the scope. It's very difficult to settle your fees if your applications haven't been submitted in the correct format or timescales, if there are specific contractual requirements. For instance, you may have to submit your invoices electronically only and on specific days. And if you haven't got your client's representatives sign off or underwriting of the fee submission, it may not get paid. That could be written into as a contract term. So it's really important you understand that as well, obviously. Sorry to sound preachy. I know this is all basic stuff, but equally it's the components that make it really important to understand, because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to go back and renegotiate changes to your contract conditions once you're actually in contract, once you've signed on the dotted line. And it's really important that actually you don't start work and you don't start delivering your services until you've got a contract in place. It's very difficult, very hard, and a lot of the time we'll work under a letter of intent, a sort of an obligation from both parties that yes, we put an offer in, you've accepted it, contract terms are being agreed, we'll continue at risk. But that's the point. You are continuing at risk until such time as that contract is signed. So get it signed, get it tucked away, but make sure you understand the scope that you're delivering under it. Conversations with clients are very easy and straightforward when you have the contract on your side, where you have the right elements in the contract. Clarity around scope. You've undertaken to do 3 feasibility studies and the client's on his 5th or 6th iteration, in the feasibility stage. You can have the conversation, you can go back. but don't deliver before you've had the conversation. You do need to make sure you're putting the markers down, so that if you are going to go beyond the terms of your contract appointment, make sure that it's clear the basis on which you're doing that, whether it's, yes, you've accepted that there's a relationship to be built and therefore you are prepared to do additional work within the stage out of the fee that's been originally agreed, or you clarify, well, this is additional scope. We'll need to have a discussion around what that fee looks like. Sorry. So, as I say, very difficult to renegotiate or negotiate on contract terms once you've signed the contract. So make sure you understand them, they provide you the right protection, and both parties really do understand them, what the limitations are. A key area for you is obviously ensuring that there's no waiver of insurers' rights of subrogation. This may undermine your professional indemnity insurance. You will have your insurers will have the right to step in and act on your behalf. If that's taken away, that may invalidate your insurance and leave you uninsured, meaning that you as a business have to then take the full hit of any potential problem that may arise. So these are fundamental things that actually you mustn't sign up to without knowing what you're doing. So notice of cancellation or material changes. Again, being clear what constitutes a change under your appointment. That needs to be very clearly understood within the context of the appointment, and making sure that notices of cancellation are reasonable and that they actually work for you, so that there's a mechanism that allows you to understand, and equally for you to be able to cancel your appointment, as well as for the client to be able to do it, and that it's not done vexatiously. We've all been there where the projects had to be cancelled, and it's understanding what that cancellation means in terms of the contract, your appointment, and the amount of effort that you need to do to close out that appointment to allow that project to be, whether it's going to be mothballed or cancelled. You've got to provide the support to the client around that. So having those cancellation clauses in is really important, and understanding what your requirements are against them is as well. Another one which is less often understood or less often happens, but there are occasions where either you're part of a large company and you've got subcontractors working for you because you're doing a complete multidisciplinary offer, or where you've got areas of expertise that you're having to subcontract into the business, whether that's building surveying, whether that's tax review, whether that's any specific nuances. You've got to ensure that the subcontract conditions are passed down, so that your subcontractors are effectively operating in a back-to-back situation with you, because you will be the first point of call for the client, regardless of the fact that you've got subcontractors. So again, things like long period policies, annually renewable, you've got to make sure that your insurance provisions are set at a level that you can afford, and that also that are commercially available to you throughout the life of your appointment. So I've whittled on quite significantly around scope as well. Obviously, understanding the basic scope of, and I've chosen QS's scope, determining the client's requirements and undertaking feasibility studies. Sounds easy, that's straightforward. But as I said, unless it's time-bound, unless it's understood how many iterations you're expected to do to provide that level of support, it can be seen as quite open-ended. Benchmarking requirements, that's, again, fairly simple, straightforward stuff. But it's, again, you've got to have the expertise and the information available to you to be able to undertake that work. So you have to ensure that you are able to satisfy all elements of the scope prior to signing up and agreeing to the appointment document that's put in front of you. So again, the areas of scope which can cause pain, assessing and comparing options is fairly straightforward. But if you helping define the project budget in the first instance, and you found wanting, that's an avenue for the client to come back and be dissatisfied. So again, you've just got to be careful that you put the right protection in for yourself in delivering the scope, that it's understood the basis on which it's provided. We've all been there where we've undertaken an assessment of initial costs for a project, and then the clients change the parameters of that as they've developed through the process, and then when the tenders are actually returned, that it bears no resemblance to that original budget. Now, it may have been tracked through issues of your cost plans and your cost tracking of every stage, but ultimately, a new person comes in, looks back at the contract. If you've not got the protection in that your information has been issued in accordance with your appointment and with the right sort of caveats to it, then you run the risk of somebody coming back at you if there is a major variance. So you do need to be careful. Again, understanding the scope is relatively straightforward. Advising on procurement strategy, all of this should be well within the remit, expense and understanding of you as a professional consultant to be able to deliver out. But what you need to understand is once you've signed the appointment, you've got to understand that, or make sure that the staff you have working with you or for you, or colleagues who are working with you or for you, actually also understand fully that scope. Because if you go beyond the scope that's agreed without putting a marker down that you have exceeded the contractual obligations, or you are about to exceed the contractual obligations, the client's under no defined liable responsibility to actually provide additional fees for that, unless you can demonstrate that it's as a specific consequence of their knowingly instructing that additional work and knowing that it's additional to the scope, which is very seldom the case. So again, it's making sure that all of the practitioners who are delivering the service for you or with you fully understand the scope of works that you're delivering, so that they can advise you, if you're the appointment holder, of anything that appears to be beyond that scope. You don't want to be going back willy-nilly to the client every time that they breathe or ask you to look at something, but equally you can't afford to not deliver the scope that's required, but not go beyond it without understanding what liabilities you're taking on by doing so. Obviously, another interesting one is assisting with the valuation of claims. It's often in lots of appointments, but you need to caveat it to ensure that it doesn't take you into the point of going to court, because that's a very costly exercise, and your advice there would need to be expert advice, and you could get drawn to doing a significant amount. So the limitation on the extent to which you are undertaking, any sort of assessment of claims needs to be very clearly defined within your scope and within the appointment itself. So, and again, the other one, attending meetings, is obvious that meetings will happen. We all know they do. The nature of those meetings, the manner of them, the frequency, all of this needs to be set out within your appointment and within your scope, so it's very clear the liability you're taking on. There are also obviously enhanced scopes as well, advising on tax issues, facilities management, life cycle costing, obtaining funding, R&M costs, specialist construction works and building types. You have to ensure that you have that expertise to be able to take on those scopes if they're in an appointment for you. So some of them may seem fairly, sort of low key, not that much of an issue. However, they can be extremely involved, and you could get into extreme difficulties if you're trying to provide a level of advice that you are not qualified to do. So that's when you do need to ensure that you are bringing in the right sub-consultancy of support, or reaching out within a wider business, depending on the type and nature of business that you're within, to make sure that the advice you're giving, the support you're giving, the scope that you're delivering is something that A, you're insured for because you have that reasonable skill and care duty, and you've got that so that you can tick the box that says, yes, we have the expertise in this area of scope to be able to deliver that service to a reasonable skill and care, then you're protecting yourself. Obviously, as I mentioned, the whole point of having the appointment in there is that there's consideration at the other end of it. You've got a requirement from a client, you've got obligations on yourselves in terms of what you can deliver, and then you've got the consideration, which is the fee that works for you to determine exactly what you can provide and how you're going to be paid for it. Now, we're all very familiar with percentage fees for a project from end to end, but that might not always work for the type of appointment that you may get. So sometimes you'll be working on lump sum fees where you've got very specific requirements, or very, very, very occasionally hourly rates, or a combination of the three, where you may have specific additional support elements which are on a lump sum basis, a traditional delivery on a percentage basis, and then variations to be agreed on hourly rates. But fundamental to it all is understanding how you can draw down on that. As I say, the cash flow of the project, understanding what the payment mechanisms are, whether you need to have completed stages. You have to be extremely careful that you're not bound by third-party performance restrictions in terms of whether you are able to, draw down your fees. If you are completely reliant on the client signing off and approving the, say, stage 3 report before you can completely call on your stage 3 fee, then you're totally reliant on a third party's opinion over not just your work, the work of the other consultants involved in the delivery of that stage. Now, that's not something to take on lightly, because it puts you at significant risk. And the risk there is obviously that the client is never satisfied that they've got what they believe they should have had as a stage 3 report. So you end up being held accountable and not being able to fully claim the fee that you've expected to draw down for a level of service that you've provided because of the performance of others. And your appointment says that you can't claim it until the client's happy. So it makes it really, really difficult. So you've got to be very careful to look out for that type of clause. Obviously, as well, there's changes, variations, understanding the mechanism of, do you have to inform the client prior to? Do you have to inform the client at the point of? If you don't understand what triggers a change and how you are able to track and agree a variation to your scope, then you're always going to be struggling to deliver profitability against an appointment that you've got, unless it just runs very smoothly and there are no changes. But that's not the way life tends to work with us. And again, clients are humans as well, believe it or not. They are open to having proper conversations and understanding that if they're asking you to go beyond the scope, that it's beyond the scope. If it's clear within the appointment that you have, then there's no argument. But where there's ambiguity, which is why, as I started this presentation, I was very clear that clarity of the brief, clarity of the liabilities that are being undertaken, the deliverables that are going to be issued, that's so fundamental. And obviously understanding what the sort of any potential retention clauses that may be in an appointment, they do happen in professional appointments. And again, a lot of that is tied back down to the fact that the client wants everybody bought into ensuring that ensuring that word, the project is delivered to a satisfactory standard. Now, you can use your best endeavours to ensure, as far as you are able, that you have delivered all of your services, but you can't ensure the delivery of a third party. So you really do have to be extremely careful on those third party restrictions. Now, I've deliberately kept this slightly light or slightly tight. I've kept it to a half-hour presentation. My reason for that is that I want to hear if there are any questions that anybody has around this. I've it is a very whistle-stops tour. I've done a lot of talking, and I've not covered specific appointments because, as I said, every appointment is different. The key elements are always that you have the parties set out within an appointment. You have the instigating parties' requirements, and you have you as the responding party's obligations and how you intend to satisfy those requirements, and you have a consideration and you have a scope of delivery. Those are the basics elements of any appointment, and understanding that and being clear on that is where everyone needs to go and be clear on. So, and the other part of my presentation is, are there any questions?
Simon, can I make 3 points to reinforce what you've said, please?
You certainly can.
First of all, from the beginning of your talk about giving advice, don't give advice at parties, particularly when you've had drinks. And that is why if you are at a party and ask a doctor, can you have a look at me bad toe or me bad finger, they won't help you because they can get caught. And in fact, it was another point
Absolutely.
is that the surveyors, if you're employed as a chartered quantity surveyor, you are also personally liable. So it means, because there was a case where somebody gave a valuation of a house. It was done on the firm's letterhead. The firm went bust. The valuation was decided it was negligent, and they actually went after the person, the individual surveyor, because the company had gone, but he was still a chartered surveyor, not chartered quantity surveyor, chartered surveyor. They went after him and won, and he was found liable because he'd given professional advice. You always cater if you want to help somebody out. And I mean, I've been to parties and people, oh, you're a chartered surveyor. What do you think the value of my house is? I don't know. I'm a different type of surveyor. So that's one thing. Second thing is, if you're using subcontractors, particularly I said you'd use tax advice. That's one thing I've always avoided, because you have to be careful that your PI insurance will cover you for giving tax advice. What I tend to do is say, here's somebody I know, and get a contract direct between them, usually an accountant on tax, but it depends on what tax it is.
Absolutely.
But that's another thing. And the final thing is, of course, surveyors' appointments are governed by the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act. So in fact, payment, you must know what you're going to be paid and when. So in reinforces what you said about third party things, because if it's on completion of sections, like if you think of when you're paying a main contractor, you either be periodic payments or section payments. QSVs, I think, are still basically largely on section payments, aren't they? Going out to tender, doing this, doing that, whatever. And so you're quite right. It's very important that if one of them is producing a report or, let's say, approval of, don't avoid approval, because the employer can then just sit there and say, well, I haven't actually approved the report, so I don't owe you any money.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
So I reinforce that. Sorry, I'm still here because my client's not ready yet. So I've texted.
No,
I'm waiting for a text, so I will just disappear. But hopefully those are helpful to reinforce your talk. But it's good talk. Thank you very much.
I mean, I see there's a couple of hands up, and I do want to come back to them. But just to pick up on your second point there as well, I am aware, and again, it's this history rhetoric that we hear about, where somebody on a phone call to a friend was asked their opinion on something. They gave it thinking they were talking as a friend, but they were asked because they were known to be a PQS. They gave their advice. Somebody made an investment decision based on that advice on an existing building, and then sued their friend because it proved to be incorrect. This is why I was so clear about make sure you caveat any advice that you give, and especially if it's over the phone. And that wasn't the person who was then held accountable, because the company was actually still there. The company that he worked for was held accountable. And it was quite a significant problem for them, considering there's no appointment in place. It was just effectively very costly advice that had been given over the phone without any thought, or with too little thought. And this was a senior person. This is just the litigious nature of the industry that we're moving into now at the moment.
There are seven very helpful words based upon what you have told me.
Yes, absolutely, Keith. Absolutely. And it's always the case. This is why I say you never know the full facts. And until you understand the full facts, you'll never understand what the outcome is. Sorry, I'm very mindful. Steve Newcombe put his hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Simon. Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting.
Good.
So I've got a couple of questions. One is based on a historic issue when I used to work in consultancy with the big practices, and the other is a more general one for me nowadays. Fiduciary responsibilities to clients don't tend to get captured in contracts, yet we still have an obligation to deliver them.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is an area where, as I said, that you need to be very clear on the scope that you're providing, and as soon as you feel you're operating outside of that scope, that's when you need to be raising the alarm bells, raising concerns, and saying, actually, this is not part of our service. We are doing this because you've asked us, and we have a relationship. However, it's not part of our service delivery. So that sort of being clear on where the money goes, how it gets sort of channeled, that's something we just got to be very careful over. It's probably not answering the question, Steve, but again,
No.
it didn't feel like a question. It was more of a statement. So I feel
it's one when I used to be when I used to work at Mott's and Sweet Group it was one that was, because I did a lot of employers agent work, it was one that created huge problems with us contractually, because you can't capture it, and it's and you legally obliged to provide it. It's just a nightmare. The other one was from these days I tend to work directly as a consultant to clients, and therefore can't replace myself, so I tend to fall under IR35 all the time. Have you found a way of contracting that actually works?
Our way of as a business, for us, we don't do it.
No, I know you're big enough.
Yeah, we just can't, and so if somebody wants an individual, we have to appoint them direct. They can't come under our remit, as it were. So that because it is too big a concern for us. And again, a lot of that is again to the risk averse nature of the business that I'm in.
Okay, so you haven't got an answer. That's okay.
I'm afraid not. Sorry, Steve.
But if anybody else has got an answer,
come back on camera.
I may be able to help. Steve, have you got a company, or is it just you personally?
No, it's a company.
And what's the problem? Because the company then contracts with them to provide you as the person.
Yeah,
that way, because it's the company, you're not caught by IR35, because a company can't be an employee. As I understand it.
No, you can. HMRC are quite clear. It can. If they specifically name an individual, then and that person is caught within it, unless if you're the predominant shareholder, which I am, anything over, I think it's 50% shareholding, you're basically caught by it.
But don't you have more than one client?
I do, but it doesn't matter. It all comes down to the statement that, can you be replaced? And if the client says no, which is generally speaking, because I'm very specialised nowadays, the client says no because there isn't anybody else you could replace him with, then I end up with this horrible situation that I get caught by IR35.
What does that mean for you then?
The tax office takes 45% of my fee before I even get it.
Dude, right, okay.
But it's not the end of the world, but it does throw a lot of other. The reason why I really asked the question, the HMRC issue is one thing. It's something you can't get around. The other issue is you're actually being classed as an employee. So when you've got an appointment document, how does that actually function alongside the fact that you're an employee? and I've not managed to square where all of how that all works, because it just doesn't it just doesn't seem to make any real sense.
I refer you to my the earlier point I made. I don't give tax advice. I've asked your accountant.
The tax advice, I'm okay. I probably know more than the accountant these days. But from the point of view of how does the contract function when you're being classed as an employee? That's you might be being classed as an employee for tax, but the issues then become who's responsible for you, who's actually managing you, who's responsible for signing off on the stuff that you're doing. It all starts to fall towards the employer, and not you as a company. And it gets quite messy, actually. So
yeah,
I'd advise anybody who use a sole trader or a small business like myself, small SME, try and steer clear of it. It's a nightmare once you get in here.
Yeah. I say not just small businesses. It's trying to avoid it being a reality again in any area. I mean, Keith, you're absolutely right in terms of get the specialists involved where you can, get somebody who's got the right level of expertise. But that doesn't mean to say you don't have an opinion. I know, sorry, I'm going off your point, I'm afraid, Steve, into a slightly broader one, but it's a little bugbear I've got. I've offered to my clients, you need to get specialist VAT advice, because they know exactly what the requirements are, and therefore they're the right people to have in. And they came in, did a big presentation, and they were going down the safest possible route. And I just challenged them with a couple of questions, not sort of over the top, but it just jarred with my understanding. So I asked open questions, and they ended up changing their advice because they agreed that actually the questions I was asking meant that they hadn't thought it through or considered it all fully, and therefore they were giving the wrong advice. The client was very thankful, and then told me, why the hell did you get me to get the experts in when you knew all that? And I said, because I'm not an expert. They are. They should be able to give you the right advice. I just asked a question and they answered it that in a way that gave you a different answer. You just have to be careful, because I'm not insured to give VAT advice.
No, I totally agree with that.
I'm not.
Yeah, the same goes with solicitors as well. You often bring solicitors in as experts and then have to challenge their position because you know it's wrong.
Absolutely. Because you know it's wrong. Just because somebody's a solicitor doesn't mean to say they're the font of all knowledge, even when it comes to things like an appointment, like a contract. They're not.
I agree.
So, because we all learn, and your experience counts for an awful lot. Sorry, I'm very mindful. Ben had his hand up as well. Sorry, Steve. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I know we haven't really answered your question, but
it's fine. I wasn't expecting it. It just was hoping.
Ben Anderson, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah,
you just taking it down.
So mine's around limiting liability and net contribution clauses. So as standard T's and C's, we'd always try and include a net contribution clause. More often than not, clients try and pull them out.
Yeah.
And sort of, I guess, asking for other people's opinions on that, why clients might pull them out, and other ways to try and limit your liability under an appointment.
Again, trying to limit your liability is imperative. You have to limit it to what's reasonable for the scope of service that you're delivering and the fee you're recovering. You know, if you leave yourself exposed to unlimited liability, without any caps or any sort of counter liability, you're not really doing yourself or the business that you're representing the right service. Clients can be quite tricky over it. They don't like net contribution. However, if as I said, if you're being held accountable for a third party's fault, and it's something that you could possibly have picked up, but you hadn't, but it's still their fault, that unless you've got an absolute obligation under your appointment to validate and vet all the information that they produce, which is unlikely because you don't have that level of expertise if it's a structural engineer's calculations. But you do what you can. So again, fight hard. It's not being unreasonable. It's not being unreasonable. You just have to give them the right context to understand why you need those clauses in, because you do need them.
And yeah, I always do. I think not that any of us are solicitors necessarily on the call, but I assume that a court would take into consideration the size of the project, the fee that was received when apportioning any loss against the claim against you as a surveyor, I guess.
Only if they have the obligation to. If you've signed up to a contract that has no sort of limits on your liability, and the client holds you 100% accountable and has a case that is justifiable against that, against your contractual obligations, your appointment details, then there's no reason for them to.
Okay.
So you again, this is why it's so important that you make sure that you have the right limits of liability stated within your appointment, and that's on scope, not just sort of against your insurance. Your insurance is one thing, the premiums you pay, that's a commercial matter. So actually trying to limit your liabilities to a commercial value because that gets you a better rate for your insurance overall, that's not the court's consideration, that's not the client's consideration, they won't care. But you still got to try and do the best you can to make sure that you are managing the risk exposure you are setting your business to, whether that's you as an individual, you as a member within a larger group, but by setting the right sort of levels of limitation on and tying it back to the scope of service you're delivering and the nature and context of the appointment that you've got.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, did that answer your question? Sorry, Ben. Yeah.
I think it probably just reinforced sort of the thoughts that go through your mind, but it's always nice to get other people's opinions on it, really.
Absolutely, and again, from my perspective, there are too many nuances around appointments for this to be a definitive presentation on anything. This is purely an open forum for discussion and debate around some of the challenges we all face. So I think that's buys into that, as it were. So I see there was something put into the chat, I think, Suzanne. I can't seem to pull it up. So.
Yes, it says a statement, please.
Right.
Often, most clients will assume the consultants will do well to inform the contractors, defend them when they are the one defaulting over contract terms, as if it's the consultants that is the owner or into JV with them. Don't know if this issue cuts across others. Thank you.
Right. This is where you act for the contract. I find if you're acting for the contract, clients can be, well, you're employed by me, not the contract, the contractor, but you're trying to be even-handed, and effectively you just got to put the context to, again, the advice that you're providing. It is only advice. We are here as professional consultants to provide our professional advice to a client. If they choose to disregard that, they can. That's entirely their prerogative. But as long as you are providing the right advice, you are protecting yourself under your appointment, that you're delivering what you need to. So don't be bullied into giving a different view because the client says, well, hold on, I hold the purse strings, you should be working for me. You just got to stand your ground and say, I'm not working for you. I'm trying to keep you out of court. Because if you follow this route, the contractor will have a case against you, which is why I'm telling you that the contractor's got a case in this point, because this is the contract that's been signed. Now we've written up the contract, but we didn't instigate any contract amendments to it. We've recommended a procurement route. This is the nature of it, and this was understood and discussed at the point in which we discussed what the procurement route should be. Hopefully that provides a bit of response.
Can I just add to that, Simon?
Yes, Steve. Yeah, please.
I've been challenged on this no end of times. It's a real pain in the arse from clients. However, normally I just tell them I'm legally obliged by law to be impartial. This is the case law. Here's a copy of it. If you want it, I'll send it by email. But I have to abide by the contract as an impartial party. I'm sorry if you feel that I'm acting against you, but I'm not.
Yeah.
And actually, once you've had that ding dong, they usually back off and they leave you alone.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, exactly, and that's a slightly more definitive response than my slightly more arms around their shoulders approach of, I'm trying to keep you out of court, and it will depend as to whether you're acting as contract administrator or employer's agent, because as employer's agent, it's them to make the assessment and you to just act under their authority, but you still have to provide the right advice.
It works for QS role, EAPM, whatever role you're doing. If you have a responsibility to financially under that contract to provide them with advice to sign off against payments, then you have an obligation under the contract to act impartially by law, just like the legal case. I forget which one it is now. I haven't had to do it for a while, but so 7 years working directly for a client, I haven't had to worry. But yeah, it's an easy one, and they do tend to, once they realise that you are obligated to do it, they tend to be more amenable to the fact that you've taken that stance.
I think a lot of the time, again, it comes down, and I think you'll find this is a common theme in any presentation I give: communication. Communication is king. If you have the right communication with your client as to why you're making a recommendation in a certain way, as long as they understand that, they'll support you. It's when and again, they may have a counter argument that actually means that, oh, actually, I hadn't seen it that way. And yes, actually, there is a link back there that is the contractor's responsibility, maybe. But unless you have the communication, you don't know. So you can't act as an automaton independently. You have to work with the client and with the rest of the team, and you have to communicate. There should be no hubris within it. There should be no edge, no angles. It's, well, this is what the contract says. This is what you're down to provide. The clients discharge their duties and obligations, so it's down to you to discharge yours, Mr. Contractor, or vice versa. The contractors discharged everything they've done things correctly. Yes, they have a valid claim for additional time, but it needs to be assessed. It may not be the time that they're asking for, but it should be assessed properly. You can't just dismiss it. You've got to give the right advice. Sorry, I don't, is that?
I think that's...
Sorry, I've just seen something else popped up. Yeah.
No, I expect anybody else got any other questions, or are we done?
Silence is golden. There's also no acceptance.
Say that. In my mind, yes.
But it is not acceptance in the eyes of the law.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, hopefully that's been useful and interesting for everyone. I don't say it's necessarily given you lots of new insights, because I'm sure you're all experienced enough, but equally having a bit of a bit of sort of a structure around it just sort of gives it a bit of reinforcing, because it's something we should all keep bearing in mind, in my opinion. Sorry, Suzanne.
Okay, no, thank you, Simon. I think you highlighted some very important issues there, and I'm sure everybody got some benefit from that. So thank you very much. It's much appreciated of you giving your time. Thank you to everybody else for attending as well. As usual, if you want a CPD certificate or a copy of Simon's slides, quick message in the chat or email me and I can sort that out for you. We're just finalising details for December. Details will be coming out to you, and there will definitely be something on the 5th of December, our next Thursday. So we look forward to seeing many of you then. So again, thank you, Simon. Good job, and thank you all. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Simon. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.